I never thought a simple family trip would expose the biggest betrayal of my life. But when a stranger showed up, calling my wife his fiancée in front of our daughters, I realized my entire marriage had been a lie. There's still some space left in the freezer, so I figured I'd swing by Kroger to grab a few more things. As I mulled over what to get, I glanced toward our 40-foot luxury van, where my wife, Kate, was leaning against the open window, chatting casually. We've been married for 20 years, and this family trip was supposed to be special. Possibly our last one like this, since in just 6 weeks, our twin daughters would be heading off to the University of Texas at Austin. Everyone had been looking forward to this trip, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different this time. Kate had been distant lately, and I was really hoping that this vacation would bring us closer again, give us a chance to reconnect the way we used to. I wanted to soak up every moment, not just with her but with our daughters too. I suggested they take a short walk together just to explore a bit before we hit the road. It wouldn't take more than half an hour, and with no strict schedule, we had plenty of time to make it from Fort Worth to Amarillo by mid-afternoon. As I started loading our luggage into the outer storage compartments of the van, I made sure everything was packed for the night in the interior as well. Inside, our 18-year-old daughters were curled up in the living area, completely engrossed in their phones, messaging their friends. A whole month away from their social circles probably felt like forever to them. At their age, friendships were constantly shifting, forming, breaking, then mending again, while the daily drama of high school life carried on without them. Staying connected through their phones was their only way of keeping up with it all. Luckily, we had the flexibility of leaving the van parked at different campgrounds, using our Toyota Highlander to go out on day trips. I hoped that between the adventure and the new surroundings, they'd be able to take their minds off everything they were missing back home. "All right, I'll make a list so we don't forget anything," Kate said, pursing her lips as she playfully made a small kissing sound. "I love you, baby," Kate added softly before turning away from the window. This morning she was dressed in her usual casual but effortlessly attractive style, black yoga pants, a matching tank top and white tennis shoes. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a ponytail, and a subtle gloss gave her lips a soft, natural shine. She had always been naturally slender, with a well-proportioned figure, and even though it had been years since her days as a college volleyball player at the University of Texas, she had only gained about 11 pounds. Somehow, she still carried the same striking beauty that had always turned heads. There was a noticeable glow about her today, a kind of excitement that reminded me of someone returning to a place they loved. When I first brought up the idea of this trip, she had hesitated, unsure if it was the right time. But over the past few weeks, her reluctance had slowly shifted into genuine enthusiasm. It had been years since we last took the van on a real adventure, not since before the pandemic turned everything upside down. The girls were just as eager as she was, excited to explore the Southwest, almost as much as they had been about our Disneyland trip years ago. Although they had inherited their mother's looks, our daughters had taken after me in other ways. Both had a natural affinity for math and logic, with a clear interest in engineering. But at the end of the day they were still teenagers, hungry for adventure and fun. I had just finished loading the last piece of luggage into the outer compartment when the sharp screech of brakes jolted me out of my thoughts. A red Mustang came to an abrupt stop, barely missing the back of our van. The driver's door flew open and a young man, probably around 20 years old, jumped out. He had short blonde hair, a mustache and an athletic build, looking far more fit than I was after 2 decades of marriage and settling into a more, let's say, paternal physique. I straightened up, bracing myself for whatever this was about. I had put on about 20 pounds during college and recently, I had started running again in hopes of shedding the extra weight. But at that moment, fitness was the last thing on my mind. The young man storming toward me had anger written all over his face. His voice rang out, sharp and furious. "Where is she, you idiot?" he shouted, his tone laced with desperation. I instinctively stepped back, caught off guard by the sudden hostility. Katie, come here. I'm taking you away from this horrible man," he yelled, his voice raw with urgency. A cold wave of confusion and dread swept over me. Who was this guy and why was he standing here screaming my wife's name? "Who the hell are you?" I shouted back, planting my feet firmly on the ground, preparing for whatever was about to unfold. If this guy was looking for trouble, I needed to be ready. "Where's Katie?" he demanded again, his voice even sharper this time. His aggression sent a sickening chill through me. At that moment, my daughters stepped out of the van, their eyes wide with confusion. I saw them instinctively reach for their phones, pressing record as the bizarre scene unraveled before them. My wife, Kate, followed close behind. The moment she saw him, all the color drained from her face. She froze, her body stiff, her breath shallow. She looked like she had seen a ghost. "Katie, let's go," the man insisted, his voice now softer but still urgent. "I'm taking you away from here, away from this cruel man. You don't have to be afraid anymore." He reached out toward Kate, his hand open, waiting for her to take it. My daughters immediately stepped in, wrapping their arms around her protectively. "Mom, who is this guy?" one of them asked, her voice tinged with both fear and confusion. "Why is he calling Dad cruel?" But Kate didn't answer. She just stood there, her eyes darting between me and the stranger. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Then the man turned to my daughters, his voice steady and certain. "I'm Kate's fiancé," he announced. "We're just waiting for your parents' divorce to be finalized so we can get married." I closed my eyes for a moment, drawing in a slow, deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. My daughters were watching, recording every second of this, and I couldn't afford to lose control. "Mom, what is this man talking about?" Kendall asked, her voice almost a whisper as she stared at Kate, waiting for an answer. I turned to my wife, my voice barely above a whisper. "Kate," I said, my throat tight. She finally looked at me, her face filled with something I couldn't quite place. Fear, guilt, panic. "Kate," I repeated, this time more firmly. "Do you know this man? Are you engaged to him?" The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. My wife stood there, silent, her eyes locked onto mine, filled with the kind of confusion that made my stomach twist into knots. I turned to the stranger, my voice steady but firm. "How long have you been dating my wife?" For the first time since stepping out of his car, he hesitated. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face before he finally answered. 9 months. We started seeing each other at the beginning of the school year. A sickening realization crept over me. If they met at the start of the school year, could he be a teacher? A coach? Someone from our daughter's high school? Judging by his athletic build, it seemed like a real possibility. He straightened his posture and continued, his voice filled with conviction. "She told me all about you. About how you manipulate her and the kids. How you mistreat them, emotionally and physically. I'm here to save her from your nonsense." Kendall stepped forward, her face a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Our father isn't involved in anything like that. And if our mom actually said those things, then she's lying to you." Taylor's voice trembled with a mix of frustration and hurt. "Mom, did you really say that about Dad?" Kate opened her mouth, struggling for words. "Let me explain." "Explain?" Taylor cut her off, her face twisting in disgust. "Are you having an affair with this man? Are you cheating on Dad?" Tears streamed down the faces of all 3 women, my daughters, their mother, all caught in the wreckage of this moment. I shook my head, feeling no need to justify anything anymore. Instead, I turned, walked over to the van, and pulled Kate's suitcase from the luggage compartment. Without saying a word, I handed it to her. The weight of the moment was crushing, but there was nothing left to discuss. Whatever had been brewing beneath the surface for months had finally erupted, and there was no putting it back together. As we continued our journey through the vast, empty landscapes of Texas, the mood in the van was suffocating. The endless stretches of flat land rolled by, broken only by the occasional lonely highway sign or a patch of farmland. We passed Wichita Falls without stopping, the sight of it barely registering in my mind. I remembered reading an old Texas Monthly article years ago when visiting my grandparents. It had ranked the worst jobs in Texas, and for some reason 9th place had stuck with me, the job of a chicken sexer, someone responsible for determining the gender of baby chicks. At the time I had laughed at the absurdity of it, but now it felt oddly fitting. Some jobs are thankless, messy, and leave you questioning everything. Kind of like what I was going through now. We didn't stop in Wichita Falls. Instead, we drove straight to Quanah, Texas. As the silence stretched between us, my mind drifted back to a different time, a time before all of this. My mother, Emily, had been best friends with Kate's mother, Tony, since 8th grade. They had gone to prom together twice, attended North Texas State University as roommates, and had remained inseparable through the years. It was at NTSU that Tony met Guy, a quiet law student. A few weeks into their relationship, Guy introduced Emily to his best friend, Don, who was also studying law. 2 years after graduating, Tony and Guy got married, and around the same time, Don and Emily tied the knot as well. Within 6 months, both couples had welcomed their first children into the world. Their love stories had seemed so perfect back then, 2 best friends marrying 2 best friends, raising their families together. It was the kind of foundation that made me believe in love, in marriage, in commitment. Now, as I sat in this van, reeling from what had just happened, I wondered if any of it had ever really mattered. Over the years, I had worked hard to build something meaningful. I had the freedom to manage my patents as I saw fit, and after much deliberation, I chose to license 3 of them while using the 4th to establish a manufacturing enterprise. Originally, we had started as 2 separate organizations, but over time we merged into one. Together we were stronger, more capable, and for a while truly content. It felt like we were meant to be, like nothing could come between us. But life has a way of shifting beneath your feet. Kate was already beginning to drift away from me. Her miscarriage had taken a toll on her in ways I couldn't fully understand. The vibrant, energetic woman I had fallen in love with seemed to fade before my eyes. She withdrew from me, rejecting my attempts to comfort her. She grew distant, shutting down every conversation that veered too close to her pain. I suggested therapy, gently encouraged her to talk, but she refused. Any mention of her feelings only seemed to make her angrier. Soon it wasn't just me she was pulling away from. She cut off friends, stopped engaging on social media, and retreated into herself completely. I found myself walking on eggshells, terrified of making things worse. I spoke with our mothers, desperate for guidance, and they reassured me, just give her time. She'll come back to you. But as time went on, it only became clearer that she wasn't coming back at all. The truth comes to light. The day I finally confronted Kate, I already knew the answer. I had gathered enough pieces of the puzzle to see the full picture. I just needed to hear it from her. Are you having an affair? I asked, my voice steady but firm. She didn't meet my gaze. No, she said quickly. I'm not cheating on you. I'm not having an affair. Then who is he? I pressed, my stomach twisting as I forced the words out. He's just a friend, she replied, her tone defensive, her eyes still avoiding mine. I need a name, I demanded. I want to know which one of your friends thinks it's acceptable to kiss my wife. Kate hesitated, her lips parting as if she wanted to say something, but then she shook her head. I can't tell you, she said finally. But I promise it won't happen again. We'll stay friends, but this is over. Completely. I stared at her, trying to make sense of her words. She wasn't sorry. She wasn't even trying to repair what she had broken, just managing it as if this was something she had control over. Later, I went through her messages, half expecting them to be deleted. But they weren't. Every text, every conversation remained untouched, as if she didn't think she had anything to hide. And maybe in her mind she didn't. After all, there was no physical evidence of an affair, just flirtation, secrecy, and the kind of emotional connection that didn't need proof to be real. But I knew. I knew that if I hadn't found out, she would have eventually crossed that final line. It wasn't a question of if, only when. I used to be naive when it came to infidelity, but over time I began to understand just how deep and complex it really was. The more I read, the more I learned. I stumbled upon online forums dedicated to affairs and betrayal, where I picked up an entirely new vocabulary. P. Affair partner. BS. Betrayed spouse. WW. Wayward wife. WH. Wayward husband. OBS. Other betrayed spouse. At first I couldn't believe how common these stories were, but soon I realized I wasn't alone. There were countless people just like me, blindsided by a spouse they thought they could trust. After everything that had happened, I made it clear to Kate that any further deception would result in an immediate divorce. No second chances. No excuses. To rebuild any sense of trust, I set strict conditions. Her phone's location services had to stay on at all times, and I monitored everything. I used a cloned iPhone to check her messages, calls, and location updates multiple times a day. I even logged into our shared Apple App Store account regularly, scanning for any newly downloaded apps that could be used for secrecy, dating apps, social media, even note-taking apps that could hide conversations. At first it felt extreme, but after what I had been through, I didn't care. She agreed to my conditions, and for a while I convinced myself that maybe, just maybe, things could be salvaged. But deep down, trust was gone. I wasn't rebuilding anything, I was just delaying the inevitable. A few years before all of this, Kate had received devastating news. She had tested positive for a genetic marker that increased her risk of breast cancer. The doctor advised preventive surgery, but after weighing her options, she chose to undergo a lumpectomy instead of a full mastectomy. Kate had always been proud of her body, especially her figure, which remained firm and untouched even after nursing 2 children. The thought of losing part of herself, of being permanently changed, plunged her into a deep depression that lingered for months. She became distant not just from me but from our daughters as well. The smallest inconvenience would set her off, and the warmth that once defined our home was replaced with a heavy, suffocating silence. I had tried to support her, but no matter what I did, it never seemed to be enough. That morning, after the confrontation with her so-called fiancé, the van was eerily quiet. The weight of everything that had unfolded pressed down on us, leaving no room for words. My daughters, who had once pleaded for reconciliation after the first betrayal, now sat in silence. They had witnessed their mother's infidelity firsthand, not once but twice. Their heartbreak had turned into something worse: disillusionment. And then there was his betrayal, the young man who had been led to believe Kate was a woman trapped in a loveless marriage, waiting for her divorce to be finalized. The realization that she had lied to him too only fueled my anger. She hadn't just betrayed me, she had built an entire false reality, stringing along another man while tearing our family apart in the process. There was nothing left to salvage. After wrapping up our time in Texas, we headed east, stopping in Nashville for a few days. The city should have been a welcome distraction, but nothing felt the same. The weight of the divorce loomed over us, an unspoken shadow in every conversation. From there, we made a brief stop in Memphis before continuing our journey. But no matter how far we traveled, the reality remained the same. This wasn't just the end of a marriage. It was the unraveling of everything I thought my life would be. I had been looking forward to visiting Graceland for years, and after my daughters watched the Elvis movie with Austin Butler's incredible performance, they were just as excited as I was. It felt like a perfect stop on our journey, one last adventure before everything changed. Our trip took us through Memphis, across Arkansas, and finally back home to Fort Worth, Texas, where it all began. A month-long adventure we would never forget. But life has a way of rewriting your plans, reminding you that no matter how much you prepare, some things will always be beyond your control. Now that the twins had turned 18, it was time for some real adult conversations. They weren't kids anymore, and I would treat them accordingly. They had witnessed everything firsthand, and I wasn't going to sugarcoat the truth. No one wants to be the villain in their own story. But that's the thing about betrayal, it forces people into roles they never asked for. It reminded me of the drama triangle, the three roles: the victim, the rescuer, and the persecutor. For Kate to justify her actions, she had to paint herself as the victim, her fiancé as the rescuer, and me as the villain. It was the only way she could reconcile what she had done with the idea of herself as a good, moral person. Then the messages started. At first, it was just texts, short, angry bursts filled with blame and frustration. Then voice messages. "Peter, please, call me now. I'm serious, it's better for you if you pick up the phone. I'm not kidding." Her words dripped with urgency, each message becoming more aggressive, more desperate. "I can't believe you decided to do this. Believe me, it won't end well for you." I couldn't help but wonder, was she panicking because of what she had lost? Or because she was finally facing the consequences of her choices? Then someone else reached out. "Peter, your wife is hysterical. You have to deal with this immediately." There was a pause before the voice continued, more measured this time. "Despite her mistake, it's important that you put aside your pride and act responsibly. Support your wife." I read the message twice, letting it sink in. Support my wife? The same woman who had lied, cheated, and ripped apart our family? The same woman who had been planning a life with another man while I still thought we had a future? There was nothing left to support. Reality hit hard as we returned home. The girls needed to move into their dorms at the University of Texas, and time wasn't on our side. Originally, the plan had been simple. We would rent a U-Haul trailer, hitch it to my truck, and drive them down together. Since they were sharing a dorm room for their first semester, moving them in should have been easy. But then their mother turned everything upside down. Chaos followed Kate like a storm cloud, and in just a few short weeks she had managed to complicate everything. When we finally pulled into the driveway, exhausted from the long trip, I immediately noticed someone waiting for us. My father was sitting on the porch. I glanced around, confused. Something felt off. Then he spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Your mom's home," he said. I followed his gaze to the house, and my stomach tightened. This wasn't over yet. I shot my father a puzzled look. "At her place?" I asked again, trying to make sense of what he was telling me. He nodded. "Yeah. And I also filed for divorce." I blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected revelation. My parents had been together for decades, and while their marriage had its share of ups and downs, I had never imagined it would come to this. But now wasn't the time to dwell on it, we had other things to handle. Our conversation paused as we turned our attention to unloading the van. Once everything was out, we gave it a thorough cleaning, scrubbing away the dust and road grime from our long trip. When the job was done, we lit the grill and cooked burgers for dinner, a simple way to unwind and reflect on our journey. As we ate, We deliberately avoided any mention of Kate, her affair, or the growing tension within our families. Instead, we focused on the good memories, the places we had seen, the laughs we had shared. The girls listened but were quieter than usual, the weight of everything still fresh in their minds. Despite my reassurances that they were welcome to visit their grandmother's house whenever they wanted, they remained polite but firm in their distance. Some wounds take time to heal and some never fully do. The days that followed were some of the hardest I had ever faced. It became clear that Kate's emotional state was spiraling. Every day felt worse than the last. She cried for hours, unable to accept the reality of the situation. Meanwhile, her parents were furious, directing their anger at me as if I had been the one to betray our marriage. My own mother's frustration toward me grew more intense as well, though for entirely different reasons. I had shut down. I wasn't answering my phone, ignoring messages and voicemails, disconnecting from everything. I just didn't have the energy to engage. Then, about a week later, Kate's parents made a decision that caught me completely off guard. They admitted her to the psychiatric ward at Methodist Hospital. They were terrified that she might harm herself, and while I hadn't expected things to escalate this far, I couldn't say I was surprised. The Kate I had once known was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized. A few nights later, I found myself standing outside her house. The lights were on inside, and the air was heavy with the stillness of late evening. My heart jumped into my throat as I knocked on the door, an uneasy feeling creeping over me. When Kate answered, I barely recognized her. Her blonde hair, once so meticulously styled, was loosely pulled back. Her skin, still lightly tanned, made her look younger than her 42 years, but there was a hollowness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. But what struck me more than anything else was what was missing. Both of her parents' cars as well as my mother's were gone. When I had driven past earlier that day, all three had been parked in the driveway. Now they had vanished. And then I saw it. Parked just 2 houses down was the same car I had seen before, the car that belonged to him. Her lover. As my stomach twisted into knots, I glanced back at Kate. She was absent-mindedly playing with her wedding ring, twisting it between her fingers. She knew he was here. And she had let him come back. Tears welled up in Kate's eyes, and her face contorted with raw emotion. "You left me," she screamed, her voice breaking. "You walked away and left me crying. He was the only one who comforted me when you were gone." Her words hit like a slap, but I refused to let them sink in the way she wanted. "You turned to him because you were upset that I left?" "Kate, I left because you cheated on me with him." The absurdity of her logic felt like an old joke, the kind where someone kills their parents and then begs for sympathy because they're now an orphan. I had heard about her lover's father before, how he had been known for wearing a leather belt with a hole in it, a memento from a bar fight where he had been shot. Not only had the man survived, but he had also managed to beat his attacker unconscious with a pool cue. It was a feat his son could never live up to. The father had died 6 years ago in a plane crash, leaving behind his oil company, which now belonged to the man who had shattered my marriage. The irony wasn't lost on me. I knew from the start that this wasn't going to be easy. Kate's family and even some mutual friends insisted that we try marriage counseling, but I refused. Our marriage didn't collapse, I told them. Kate did. And even now she was stuck between two worlds. She was convinced our marriage was over, but she refused to move forward with him unless I forgave her. It's textbook monkey branching, I explained to anyone who would listen. She was holding on to me while keeping the other option within reach, unwilling to let go of either until she was certain she wouldn't fall. Then Kate made her final offer. "If you promise to stay with me," she pleaded, "I'll tell him I can't marry him. I'll return the ring." I stared at her in silence, taking in the sheer ridiculousness of the situation. "Kate," I said evenly, "the fact that we are even discussing your engagement to another man while you're still married to me should tell you exactly how broken this marriage is." She looked down, absently twirling her wedding ring between her fingers, the same way she had done that night when I found him waiting outside. In the months that followed, she fought to stall the divorce in every way possible. Her lawyer, DK, was skilled, delaying hearings, filing endless motions, anything to drag the process out. But in the end it was all just wasted effort. I transferred ownership of the house to Kate, sold my business for just the value of its physical assets, and split the proceeds. Half went to her, along with half the rights to my patents. It was my way of closing the chapter. Kate, however, still seemed desperate to keep the book open. I took it even further. I offered to completely transfer the remaining assets, terminating the old licenses and replacing them with new ones. With that, my chapter with Kate was finally closing, but a new one was just beginning. PTK Incorporated. It was a company no one had ever heard of, but to me it meant everything. The name had come together almost by accident, formed from the initials of Peter, Taylor, and Kendall. My daughters and I had built something new out of the wreckage, something that was ours alone. I looked at them, their intelligence and resilience shining through, and smiled. Raising my glass, I toasted to my two brilliant daughters. Kendall quickly changed the subject, but I could see the emotion in her eyes. "Mom is getting married next Saturday," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "She wants us to attend the wedding." I froze, shaking my head in disbelief. How could I not know about this? That evening I found myself on the deck, a place I often went to think. Sitting there, I picked up my guitar, an old companion I had long neglected. I wasn't much of a player, but in moments like these, when emotions ran deep, I would pluck at the strings, usually with a glass of bourbon in hand. It had been over a year since I had last played, and my fingers fumbled over the chords as I tried to bring back the familiar intro to Guy Clark's LA Freeway. The notes used to flow effortlessly, but now they stumbled just like my thoughts. As I tried to regain my rhythm, my phone began buzzing, pulling me back to reality. The next morning, the four of us piled into the car and merged onto I-35, heading north toward Dallas. What stunned me most was my father's sudden decision to join us. When I asked him why, he just smirked and said, "I can't miss the drama." Once we arrived, I walked him to the Hilton Hotel so he could check in, then took the girls to the hospital. The receptionist led us into the waiting area, and the moment I stepped inside, I spotted a lone man sitting in the corner, staring gloomily at the floor. Then I saw her, my mother. The moment she noticed me, she turned, her expression instantly hardening. Her anger was unmistakable. "This is unconscionable," she muttered under her breath. Kendall touched my arm gently. "Mom wants to see you, Dad," she said softly. I looked up and saw the pleading eyes of my mother and Kate's parents, all waiting for me to respond. Kate's father finally spoke, his voice low but insistent. "Please, Pete." It would mean so much to her. I let out a slow breath, shaking my head sadly. There was nothing left to say. "I can't," I said, my voice steady but heavy with finality. "I'm not family anymore. I'm not even a friend. I'm just the man she was once married to." The words lingered in the air, settling over us like a weight none of us could shake. Then the tears came. After leaving the hospital, I stepped outside, taking in the cold reality of it all. 4 days later, we were back in Austin, returning to the life that had been unraveling for months. Before I left Fort Worth, I had one last conversation with my father-in-law. We talked about everything, about Kate, about the past, about the wreckage that none of us knew how to clean up. But in the end, there was nothing left to do but move forward. The wedding came and went. Kate had slipped away before the bride and groom's first dance, leaving Emily and my mother to search for her. I could only shake my head. There was nothing I could do anymore, no words, no actions that could undo what had happened. I had loved Kate deeply, unwaveringly. Even after everything, I couldn't deny that bond. But life moved on. The girls settled into college. My new patents proved to be a success and sales for the company took off. With a steady foundation beneath me again, I finally decided to take a step into the unknown. I started dating. I was skeptical at first, unsure if I was truly ready, but my daughters encouraged me. And so, cautiously, I began. Somewhere along the way, I met Elizabeth. She had been through her own share of struggles. She had once married another lawyer, a man who had seen her as little more than a stepping stone to advance his career. He had hoped that by marrying her he would secure a place at Bonham, McLeod and Garcia, the oldest and most prestigious law firm in Texas. When his ambitions fell apart and he realized marriage wouldn't give him the leverage he wanted, he changed. The divorce was quick and painless for Elizabeth, but her ex-husband was so devastated that he packed up and moved to California, leaving everything behind. For Elizabeth, marrying an older man wasn't an issue, it was stability that mattered. One morning, she walked into the hallway in dark yoga pants and a white t-shirt, her stomach slightly swollen. I had once considered getting a vasectomy but had never actually gone through with it. Now, staring at her, a strange mixture of emotions washed over me. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement. I turned. Kate stood in the doorway. My wife, stood in the foyer, confusion etched across her face. Carefully I closed the door. "That was the woman I was married to," I said quietly. I never saw Kate again. But I heard she was in bad shape. She had lost her way completely. And, eventually she was placed in a psychiatric facility.